Hey, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Meteor Kaiser here, back again with part 2 of the Fire Emblem Fates Birthright Women Only run that we're doing. On the last part, well, I mean, we kind of just got to like chapter 15, but I'll just go over the rules real quick once again. So obviously no characters that aren't female, I'm not allowed to use any children characters, no extra items from Wi-Fi, no optional battles, and I'm allowed to get stuff from the fort, basically. So no reclassing or any of that. It also isn't an Iron Man. I just want to make sure that you guys are clear on that. So resetting will be a thing, and I will point out when resetting happens. But if you guys have not seen part 1, go ahead and check that out before you start this, because there's not really much point in watching the second part of this, because this is like halfway through the run. But anyway, the last that we left off, we just did chapter 15, Wolfskin and Peak, and after that we moved on to chapter 16, Pleasure Palace. So to start off on chapter 16, Pleasure Palace, we get Felicia, who rejoins us after being gone for a while. She is actually it's weird, she's our last unit that joins. So after this we don't have to go through any character sort of profile things, but she rejoins us as a level 13 maid with 7 strength, 14 magic, 15 skill, 17 speed, 20 luck, 7 defense, and 14 resistance. Now, not terrible by any stretch of the imagination, and it's good to have that extra healer. But the problem with it is her level is quite low for this point in the game, where I'm starting to get those promoted units. So definitely not the best in that sense, but I will be using her as a nice healer, which, you know, is very, very useful. So to describe the chapter, I'd have to just say it's extremely awkward. So basically the map is split up into like this weird little chamber where you have to like siphon your units through to get to the end, and all of your units spawn on the left side in kind of like a line going down, almost like a little tunnel. And so the enemies starting are actually to the south, the north, and the east. The only direction there's nothing is west. And so south has some armor knights, north has a hero, and then the east has a bunch of mages and archers. So the biggest problem here is most of my units have really bad resistance, so I've got to play pretty careful and use Corrin a lot, as Corrin has a nice resistance. And Kagero also has decent resistance, so I tend to use those two a lot more in this chapter. And Hinooka is obviously very good defensively, but archers are the problem here. There's a lot of mage reinforcements coming from the stairs, but at least they spawn at times where my units are surrounding them. Once we're able to kind of clear out the south, then the north, and then the east, we move on to that end area. But there's 2 fire orbs, so that puts Scarlet out of commission because she's got like 0 resistance. So I have to be very careful about those enemy ranges. Thankfully, once I'm able to deal with those guys, I move on to the boss Iago, and Iago isn't that bad. He's very powerful. He has a Gnungagap, which is a really, really strong tome, and that tome gives him 39 attack, but low enough speed that Kagero can tank while dealing 24 damage, giving Hinooka enough wiggle room to finish him off. And with that, we're able to move on to chapter 17, Lost in the Ice. This one, thankfully, is super easy, but I went about it in the wrong way. There is a correct way and an incorrect way to complete this chapter. So what I did was I froze the lake immediately when I should have cleared out the right side of the map first. Also, I went into every village forgetting that 4 of the 6 villages actually just spawn enemies instead of giving you items. Despite this, the enemies aren't that bad in this chapter. You just have to be kind of careful in the midpoint when you trip an invisible line kind of in the middle of the frozen lake, and a bunch of reinforcements will spawn in once that's tripped. This chapter has a lot of promotions. I promote Setsuna into a sniper because I definitely think having a master of 1 is better than a master of none in this run. I want her to be specified to that archer skill because I think everyone else can kind of go more of a general role. I promoted Orochi into an Omyoji because that means I have an extra unit that can heal, which is really helpful because, you know, the more heals I have, the better. It gives me more options. I promote Hana as well into a Swordmaster for the exact same reason as Setsuna, and honestly, probably the best decision I've made for this run. And Hana is going to be my best unit, and I'll focus more on why that happens a little bit later into the run. The boss Florina is pretty decent, but not as scary as Iago, so I was able to use my nuke unit, Setsuna, to just 2 around her. I call Setsuna my nuke unit because she's very powerful, but also super duper frail. She's got 7 defense and 12 resistance, but 27 speed and 16 strength. She can pretty much destroy low defense enemies real quick. And with that, we're able to move on to chapter 20, Leo. This is a very interesting chapter. So starting off, there's only 3 enemies. It's just Niles, Odin, and Leo himself. But every single turn, faceless enemies will spawn from the marshes. Those faceless enemies are really weak, and I'm able to deal with them quite easily, but the sheer amount of faceless enemies is insane. Faceless enemies are always gonna be pretty easy. They're very strength oriented, so if you have good defense, you're chilling, but just getting overwhelmed with numbers is basically the situation here. So Leo has 3 dragon veins that he can use to spawn bigger groups of faceless, and those will trigger the closer that you get to him. Still, it's not that bad. Just try and avoid the marsh that's in the middle, as it'll deal poison damage over time to your non-Norian units, which is pretty much most of your units. Niles and Odin aren't really that difficult, but Leo is really scary with his well-rounded stat pool, and he has a solid 27 attack with his Brynhildr tome. So not as scary as the nuking Iago was for just sheer damage, but he's got more defense and resistance, so it's harder to take down. But even then, this is kind of where Hana starts to pick up. So she has at level 1 as a swordmaster, 56 avoid, and this will only go up with better weapons. She's currently got 30 speed, which is really good. So I'm basically having her as my dodge tank. So if she gets hit, she pretty much will die or go really, really low. But the chances of her getting hit are pretty low. So that's why it's kind of a risk-reward type situation here. But she was able to completely annihilate Leo, and with that we were able to move on to chapter 19, Rainbow Sage. In this chapter I take care of one of my next promotions. I get Oboro into a Spearmaster, because I've kind of got enough scroll users already, and I don't really need her to be anything but a Spearmaster. Chapter isn't as bad as it seems, but I've always found this one to be a bit scary, just because of all of the stairs. So the start of the map is split off into 2 sections, and you basically teleport to different sections, and you have to defeat the enemies in there and then move on to the next section, and then so on and so forth. And some enemies are paired up in the beginning, so it's very important to take it slow with the first couple of rooms and just deal with one pair at a time as to not lose anyone in a dumb manner. So this is also another place where I kind of messed up, but not too badly. So in the left side we have enemies with low defense but high resistance. And in the right side we have enemies with high defense but low resistance. So it's a good idea to split up your units accordingly to who can deal with the low defense units and who can deal with high defense units or low resistance units. As I'm clearing through these rooms, we make our way to the last room, and the last room's probably the scariest one because it has a Berserker Swordmaster pair, and that Swordmaster has guard stance. So it's very, very terrifying. If left alone, the Berserker can pretty much kill any of my units, and the Swordmaster guard stance can defense against pretty much most of my units as well. So my strat was to have Rinka, Scarlet, and Hinooka go through first, as they can tank a hit, and then have the rest of my units come through after the enemy turn. Because I did that, I was able to kind of just surround the Berserker, because the Berserker's not that difficult if you're able to live one hit, because it's one unit. It can't do too much. It's the same thing as the boss, right? The boss was pretty easy in this situation. It's just a regular general, and Kagura was doing the most of the work, and I let Mozu get the finish off here because she hasn't really seen much action this run. But with that, we're on to chapter 20, Fort Dragonfall. Fort Dragonfall is such a joke of a chapter. Absolutely nothing poses any threat, but they have unlimited enemy reinforcements. It's just a bunch of faceless, similar to chapter 18, but the boss does 29 damage, which really, at this point, isn't really going to affect me that much. So a good strat would be to kind of use this area as a grinding zone if you need that, but I was trying to avoid pointlessly grinding, so I kind of just went through the chapter as I normally would. And that's kind of it for the easy chapters. There's a couple that are like not as bad, but there's nothing that's going to be quite this easy going forward. And it really does pick up in chapter 21, Burning Falls. So this map is split up into 4 different sections with bridges that go between each one of those sections. And in order to cross between the bridges, there's a dragon vein that you have to hit. Well, there's actually 2 per little statue thing with the bridges. So there'll be 2 different outcomes depending on which dragon vein you activate. One will let you just go through to the next area, no hassle, and the other one will spawn in a bunch of lava tiles and will give all of your units, well, ground units, damage over time. So it's important when you're activating the dragon veins that you want to go under the one where the orb is. So the dragon will be holding an orb in one of his hands. If you go under which one that is, you'll be able to get through to the next area safely. So flyers are a big double-edged sword in this chapter. I say that because you're able to avoid all of this lava and you're able to just move wherever you need to in the map, but there are archers literally everywhere in this map. Very high amount of archers, and I don't have no Delphi shield or anything like that to protect my flyers. So I end up being way too scared to do any of that flying nonsense. So instead of splitting my units up kind of between my ground and my flyers, I end up just kind of moving them all as one unit and then letting my ground forces take care of those archers before moving my flyers in to do more. And I had to reset a couple of times due to poor placement of my flyers, forgetting the ranges of those archers, and then just forgetting which Dragon Vein to activate because, you know, brain don't work sometimes. So the main enemy of this map are Stoneborns, and Stoneborns are extremely defensive monsters, and they hit really hard, and they have between 1 to 5 range, but their kind of bad thing is they have really low accuracy, which makes units like Hana and Kagero great because the Stoneborns have barely any chance to hit. And I have to play semi-fast in this chapter because while the lava will not spawn immediately, if you're in one area for too long, the lava tiles will just automatically come in, so it's important to not take your time with this chapter. So the boss monster is very easy for Hana to take down with her Spirit Katana, which does a lot better against monsters, and I'm able to get a crit with her, which helps a lot. And this is one of those defeat bosses chapters, so as long as you can just bum rush for the boss, you can ignore all the other enemies that are hanging around. And now we're on to chapter 22, Hidden Capital. This one's not quite as bad as chapter 21 was, but it's still got its gripes about it. So first we head towards the south area, and we clear out the enemies that are kind of like spawned below us, which there's 2 fire orbs on either side, but we spawn close enough that we don't really have to worry with them. We could just take them out real quick. So I play very defensively, making sure that my range is on, that I can see the enemies at all times, because there are a few berserkers hanging around the map. And berserkers are probably scariest when there's 2. One you can kind of take care of, but if they have units where you don't want to be in their range, but you have to be in range to deal with the berserkers, and that'll happen a lot later on, especially on a couple of chapters coming up actually, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But thankfully we have Hana, and as I was saying before, Hana makes life real easy because they cannot hit her. So as long as I'm okay with taking that risk, I just go straight for dealing with those berserkers. And once the berserkers are dealt with, the boss sure is really easy to take care of. He's one-rounded by Kagero, and then all I have to do is just clear up the rest of the enemies and move on. Now we're at chapter 23. Chapter 23, Camilla, is the hardest chapter, both physically and gimmickly. Gimmickly, I think that's a word, maybe? I don't know. So the gimmick in this chapter is Camilla has Dragon Veins, 3 of them, that she can rotate between, depending on where your units are currently at. And those Dragon Veins will deal 10 damage that go down the duct lines kind of vertically down to anyone that's in that open area. Which means in order to avoid damage, you kind of have to put all of your units in those kind of corridors between the sections, which makes it extremely tight. So that means you can't really have enemies surrounded. So each encounter is kind of more like a 1v1 situation, which means you have to put like your really strong units out. And you're not able to get all of them into those tunnels, unfortunately. So you're going to have a lot of units that are taking damage. 10 damage per turn is nothing to scoff at. One thing that's good here is Reina and her Amaterasu skill, which does 20% base healing to adjacent allies. But again, that's not going to be like, that's nice, but 20% is definitely not like 30 to 40%, considering some of my units are only like 20 to 30 HP. So the only way I felt that I could deal with this chapter was by pairing up my units. So basically putting my low health units with some higher health units, because I kept dying a lot. I had a lot of resets this chapter. There was a ton of really mobile units, so wyverns and cavaliers, that were just able to catch up to my army real quick. And I couldn't really position like having like a certain wave of enemy coming, so I could only deal with a few enemies at a time. Rather, I had to deal with several at once when I didn't have much health to go off of. And it's a good thing that I did have those more healers, because they went through a lot this chapter. A lot of experience for all of my healers. So the most difficult part of this chapter was definitely the beginning, as you kind of had to deal with the most difficult enemies. Those malignites and other things were the worst, but those enemy reinforcements were not clearly as bad. So basically the first and the second tunnel that we went through were definitely harder than that third one that we went through. So about midway to almost like 75% through the chapter, Arthur and Effie are actually there and can be temporarily recruited, but honestly, I completely forgot. So, oops. But, I mean, it's only a temporary recruitment, and I could only use Effie anyway, so it isn't the end of the world. Maybe I could have used her as death fodder, but oh well. So once you get close enough to Camilla, she leaves her dragon veins, so the rest of the chapter is pretty much a joke. Camilla goes down simply to just a single shot from Reyna, and then all I have to deal with is Selena and Baruka, who are paired up, but still, I can surround again, which is great. And so that just took me an hour and a half to deal with this chapter, and that's going to be a common theme going forward. Next, we move on to chapter 24, Tears of a Dragon. Now, this chapter is pretty much just as bad as the last one. Honestly, it took me about the same amount of time. However, it's difficult in different ways. So we don't have any like map-wide kill mechanics, but there are just like harder enemies in general to deal with. So this is akin to the very, very beginning of the game. So you spawn in the middle of the map. And so first of all, what I decided to do is I decided to just clear out the south enemies, which is a few generals and a couple of other guys, because I just want to clear that area up and it kind of makes it safer for me. So one of several problems with this chapter is, first of all, there are consistent enemy wyvern reinforcements from the southeast, the southwest, the northwest, and the northeast. And they kind of rotate. There's a pattern to them, but they basically spawn every single turn in pairs of 2. And so my problem is now I basically have my 3 flyers, so Reyna, Scarlet, and Hinooka, who are stopped from doing anything else because I want to be able to deal with these enemy wyvern reinforcements before they reach my main army, where they can target some of my weaker units like Azura, Sakura, those types of characters. So while that's happening, what I end up doing with the rest of my ground forces is I bait the units that are both on the immediate left and right down towards my army in the south. And I'm just trying to make life a little bit easier for myself later on, so I could just clear out what I can and take my time. So it would have been nice to have my flyers when it came to a few of the enemies here. So the biggest other problem is there are berserkers and mages, or sorcerers. So the sorcerers are attached to fire orbs, which deal AoE to your units, which is kind of a pain like last chapter, where it's not gonna do too much to your units, but it will have that solid AoE effect and it'll do damage to all your units. And that gives the berserker enough time to be able to kill pretty much anything. And if you want to deal with the sorcerer, you're gonna have to face the berserker. If you want to deal with the berserker, you're gonna have to face the sorcerer and then some extra generals and heroes that are along the path. So it's just a very, very tight and annoying chapter for having to deal with multiple enemies at once. And you don't really have a very clear path to success, because if you deal with one thing, you're going to get screwed over by the other. So honestly, I didn't really have a great strategy going through this. I kind of just relied on luck. I relied on Hana and I relied on a few of my other units to get crits and to just not get hit and just get lucky. And of course, not having Hinooka around to deal with the berserkers and other sort of like malignites and stuff like that is very, very difficult. The only strategy I kind of had was to just try and see how little enemies I could aggro at a time. Because, I mean, like, for example, units like Kagero could really deal with both easily, but had a harder time on enemy phases with like generals and just a few extra wyverns scattered around. Another great help has been Hana for this chapter, so sort of midway through the chapter when I'm dealing with the mage and the berserkers, I have Hana, Reyna, and Hinooka on the right side of the map, clearing out both enemy wyvern reinforcements from the right side and then a bunch of heroes that spawn on the right side. So Hana is very, very useful because she has Astra by this point, and Astra is just a great skill to have, and also that really, really high avoid that she has makes that side a little bit easier to deal with. And so after just a few trial and error runs, enough resets, I was basically able to get lucky enough to be able to get through the chapter and make my way to Hans. And then Hans himself isn't that bad because he doesn't move and he has pretty low resistance. So units like Orochi are going to do wonders here. And with that, thank God I'm able to move on to chapter 25, Traitor Revealed. Alright, so this chapter was a lot easier than the last two, but that's for one specific reason. And you're going to be hearing this name a lot. Hana. So the beginning bit was a bit difficult as we had very like mobile enemy units like bow knights and paladins that posed a big threat to my slower moving, less tanky units. And so in order to give myself less sort of things for the enemies to attack, I paired up a lot. Because this chapter doesn't have that many enemies, but their level and difficulty are a bit harder than the previous ones. So I split up my army in half after paired up, and I send one half to each side. And once I kind of like converge on the center. There's berserkers, mages, maids, heroes, generals, you name it. Basically all of those types of units. And so after trying a few strats, I realized unfortunately my best method was to let Hana, who was paired up with Setsuna to be able to get some stat boosts, was my best method. So Hana, currently at the level she's at right now, has 88 avoid, and she's got a speed of 47 because I have equipped the practice katana to her, which gives her +5 speed, which is -1 defense and resistance. But I'm not looking to get hit here. I'm just looking to dodge everything. If I'm able to get through and just be able to heal up on player phase, I should be able to beat this chapter easily. And thankfully, that actually is exactly what happens. My Hana does go low, but I have some concoctions and some other things prepared for her, and she just does not die. So I'm able to easily make my way through those units and to the boss Iago, who has an 8% hit chance on Hana. So again, Hana completely clutched this chapter for me. Alright, next up we move on to chapter 26, Xander. So there are two ways that you can complete this chapter. Basically, you have Corrin and then you have your army. So Corrin is in the middle doing a 1v1 with Xander. And then the rest of your army is kind of on the outskirts of the arena, and they will go ahead and fight against Xander's units. So you can either go through and clear it just like a normal chapter, where you use all your units to beat all the enemies and then go after Xander. Or, well, so that's the best method if you want to get more XP or like extra items or whatever. But if you're kind of in a crunch position like me, you can just straight up have Corrin just annihilate Xander. Now, originally when I did try this, I did try and go for that first method, and it failed. So then I tried again, but just trying to go with Corrin, but realized that Corrin is kind of weak, so I used some of my stat boosting items that I have kind of just laying in the back that I haven't touched yet, and I use a few on Corrin, and with my third reset I'm able to just have enough stat boosts that I'm able to take out Xander in a few turns, and that's the chapter. It's very short if you go through that method. And next we move on to chapter 27, King Garen. So make sure before you even go into this chapter that you do all of your last minute preps at the fort. So this means, again, we'll get to this later, but this means using up your stat boosting items, making sure all your units have the right weapons, doing any last minute grinding if that's what you want to do, or any of that kind of stuff. Make sure that happens, because this chapter and the next chapter are back to back, much like most Fire Emblem games. So, King Garen. On this chapter, on hard difficulty, most of all enemies are in groups of 2. And with the average level being around 16 to 17-ish, but you'd think they'd just be 20 by this point. But even then, it's still kind of difficult because of the lack of me doing any grinding. So most enemies have pretty low resistance, so mages are going to be really great here. However, the problem with that is if I use my mages, they're going to be in range of the Great Knights, and there's a lot of Great Knights scattered throughout who have a big old movement stat. Make sure you have your enemy ranges on, and just try and what I do at least is I try and deal with one enemy pair at a time. And that shouldn't make it too bad. The hard part kind of this chapter is when you're getting closer to Garen himself. So there is a berserker in the middle right before you get to him, and then there's also the 2 units that are surrounding Garen, and all 3 of those have skills. And there's not very many enemies in this game besides from like boss characters or mini boss characters that have skills. So nameless NPC enemies is just weird to have. And for example, a couple of these skills, the maid has Pavise and a lot of defensive skills, and then the berserker has like Swordbreaker, Vengeance, Counter, those types of skills that are going to be great for dealing with, you know, because berserkers are weak to swords, but then if we have Swordbreaker, that's not going to really do much. So just be very careful because there's a few berserkers that don't have skills. If you run into the one that does, kind of a yikes. And if you're playing on Lunatic, there are going to be 3 berserkers instead. So it's important to just kind of surround these guys and deal with them quickly. The berserker's not too bad because he's out of Garen's range, but after a few attempts I'm able to kind of get over to Garen, and I have a sort of plan in mind. After a few attempts I realized, oh crap, Hana's my best bet again. So yet again we have our Hana based strategy. So Setsuna again is paired up with her, because I'm like, well, if it isn't broken, let's just not fix it. Let's just go with it and hope and pray that everything goes just as well as it did the last chapter and the chapter before that. Hana is able to first deal with the sorcerer, so I have no other units in the range of either Garen, or Garen can't attack anyone but Hana. I take care of that sorcerer first because I think he's going to be the only issue. And then Garen with his Bulwark has an 18% chance to hit Hana on enemy phase and a 0% chance to hit on player phase. So I'm kind of okay with those odds. 18%, I'm not too scared about that. And the thing is, even if he does end up hitting me, the Bulwark does 37 damage and Hana has 40 HP. So I would still live and I'd have enough time to be able to heal up with my other units. Because I do have like Sakura who has a physic, and then I could just trade that away and always be able to heal up. So I want to make sure I take care of that maid next, so it isn't able to heal up Garen. And then I proceed with the slowest boss fight of my life, because Hana is only able to do 6 damage times 2 with her Hagakure blade. So it's going to be a pretty slow fight. And of course, with Garen being able to restore some HP every turn, it's not that quick. So thankfully, even though... But I mean, I'd honestly rather take a slow fight than a terrible fight. Like, for example, in that Fire Emblem run that we did not that long ago, I had a horrible time dealing with the final boss. So this is just a lot nicer, even though this isn't the final boss. To speed things up, I'm able to use Scarlet, and then Scarlet has her Rally Strength skill. As long as I'm 2 tiles away, I'm fine. And with that, it kind of made my Hana be able to do 14 times 2, which is a lot better. So after a few turns, I was able to deal with Garen real quick. And we move on to endgame. Oh, endgame. What a pain this one was. Okay, Dawn Breaks is the name of the chapter, and this one is harder than chapter 23 was. So not only do I have several resets, I end up having to deal with going through a lot of different strategies. You spawn, again, very simple, you spawn in the middle area, and there are enemies surrounding you on all sides, with the boss, Dragon Garen, or whatever you want to call him, at the very north. Originally I first attempted to just kind of have my units scatter and then deal with enemies as I could, and then I try to have them kind of like group up in the center, and neither of those worked. So I end up having to pair up very specific units to maximize my damage and my resistance and my heals. All of my damage units were partnered up, and then I had anyone who could heal was unpartnered, so they'd be able to maximize how many people that could heal. So I had Rinka and Kagero, I had Hinooka and Korin, Scarlet and Reina, Setsuna and Hana, and then the rest were kind of just ungrouped. My best bet was to just have all of my units group up in the center on the first turn and make my way south with some of my speedier but less defensive units, so I can go around and picking off individual enemies. I do that with Hana and Kagero basically, because I feel comfortable leaving them by themselves. At least the good thing with this chapter is units do only move if you enter their range, so it gives me a little bit more time to work with that. I think the single biggest problem about this chapter was how varying the enemy units were. There's Stoneborns, there's heroes, there's archers, there's wyverns, generals, you name it. Literally every single type of enemy is basically in this chapter. And the problem that creates is if any of these units are together, the amount of variety, like if one of my units is able to deal with like a Stoneborn, they might have problems with a general or an archer or something like that. So just having that pure variety makes my life a lot more difficult. So it's just really hard to know where to send my units. So the mechanic for this chapter is turn 5 and onwards, or whenever you get near Garen, he'll activate a Dragon Vein, and this Dragon Vein will turn 1/4 of the map into blight each turn, and if you're on that tile it'll deal 10 damage to all units. Turn 5 is 1/4, 6 is 1/4, 7th is 1/4, and 8th is 1/4. And the only areas that are going to be safe is that initial middle area where you spawn, and where Garen is at the very top. By the time I'm kind of able to convene my units, deal with the enemies in the south, and start moving my way to the north, it ends up being around turn 7, so I'm 1 turn away from a full blight. Because this is a boss clear chapter, I decide to just ignore the rest of the enemies that are in the north. I just end up going straight for Garen. In the last chapter I was able to give a pair of boots to Hana, so she has like 8 move I think. She's able to make a lot more ground real quick. I have Hana go up against Garen. This is a little scarier than the last Garen fight, because the only problem here is Garen will now be able to one-shot. Garen does around 42 or so damage, and I only have the 40 HP. But it's a 23% chance to hit, whereas it was 18 before. Still, those are odds I'm willing to risk, and you know, if I have to reset, I have to reset. But all I really need to do with Hana is to just get some damage on Garen, and with that some damage, I'm able to move my Hinooka Korin pair up, and by this time as well, Korin has the Blazing Yato, the upgraded form of the Noble Yato, and this is a lot better of a weapon I mean, Corrin isn't that great. My Corrin has been very mediocre the entire run. But this is the one chapter where my Corrin shines. Because with the Blazing Yato, I deal 17 times 2. And Garen has around 80 or so HP, as you would for a final boss. But I'm able to get a crit, which brings him down into the red. And then Kagero is just able to quickly throw a shuriken and kill him. And I've done it. I've beaten this goddamn game. This was a very, very cool experience. I quite enjoyed this. I know I've done the female run before, but it was a lot more stressful than I thought it would be. I thought Birthright would be just a breeze because it's Birthright, but I kind of underestimate how important it is to have like units like Takumi and Ryoma who are just really, really good. So yeah, this was a really good experience. I'm going to be doing something very similar like with this, with Conquest, but I have something even cooler planned next. Well, cooler for me. I don't know if it'll be cooler for you guys, but this is a new experience for me. So thank you guys so much for watching. My name has been Media Kaiser, and by the time that this comes out, I would have hit 1,000 subs. So I want to just say a very big thank you to everybody who's supported me so far, and look forward to the things to come. But if you haven't subbed, and you'd like to, most of the people that do watch my videos, I will say this, most of the people that do watch my videos are not subscribed. So if you haven't subscribed already, it would be very, very appreciated. Thank you so much. I've been Media Kaiser, and as always, peace!